trailing your other microphone there. See the one there?
This is the video mic, right? John, thank you for the very gracious introduction. I will mimic our former President Bill Clinton. I will smoke it but not inhale it. It was very, very gracious words. John and I do indeed share a great affection for Darlington School in Georgia. Another one of our those attached to Darlington you may know was Roger Mudd, who died earlier this year, who was a teacher there, perhaps when you were there or thereabouts, sometime around the same. A little later. A wonderful school, and I certainly am indebted to Darlington for much that has happened in my life since then. And I certainly also share that Navy pedigree, although not to the same rank as John, and find it having been a remarkable preparation for being a college president. And people ask me that all the time. I don't, because I'm in an academic environment, I'm in a new career, I don't talk a lot about the Navy, but now and then some word will come out that's only understood by people in the Navy, and people look at me with a strange look, and I realize that I've said something that I have to translate. But people ask me, what are the things about the Navy that most have helped you as a college president? And I tell them that if you can deal with sailors, you can deal with humanities faculty. I tell them that if you have a sense of humor, which you have to have in the Navy, you can pretty much do anything in higher ed because there's much to laugh about. If you have been through crises, and all of us certainly were at various times in the Navy, the crises that hit us in higher ed are things that we don't frankly get too bothered about, and I will include the pandemic in that, which I'm going to talk about today. Certainly the sense of teamwork that we depend upon in the Navy is something that I work to build among those who work for me in any context, but that certainly has translated very, very well. And a very unusual aspect of military life, I think, translates well into higher ed. People in higher ed don't move if they're happy, if they're content. At King, we have very, very low turnover. And in the Navy, when you go to command or you go to be a supervisor of others, you inherit the people that are there. You don't really have a choice, with rare exceptions. And I had one tour of duty where I got to choose those who worked for me. But for the most part, you inherit the people that are given to you. And so you have to develop them and motivate them and inspire them, put them in the right places where they will succeed, rather than what perhaps is an instinct in other contexts to simply clean house and bring new people in. And I think that's another really good preparation for higher ed. It was nice yesterday. We had a farewell on the campus for a long-serving administrative assistant, and we gathered in the dining hall to wish her well, or in Navy terms, to wish her fair winds and following seas as she left. But it did not hit any of us till we got in the dining hall that this was the first time as a university in 15 months that we had gathered with nothing on our faces, with nothing between us, no computer screen, no 6 feet of distance. It was a totally normal moment. And this drop-in function, where people would normally stay for 10 or 15 minutes, went on for several hours. Such was the jubilation and enjoyment of finally being human again, of finally being normal again, and enjoying the richness of our community. I'm sure you feel many of those same things, including in this room today, but it's a wonderful thing, is it not, to finally be rid of the pandemic largely, and to have a normal life in front of us. We certainly have tried to accomplish that at King throughout the pandemic, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about how that went for us and what we're looking forward to in the fall. I'm going to talk a little bit today as well about the challenges that we have ahead. And when I say we, I speak not only of King, but of schools like King. And I'm probably going to end with be a bit provocative, and I'm going to suggest to you some of the things long term that worry me about higher education, and I think should worry you as well, because I think higher education fulfills, particularly in our country, an extraordinarily important role. And when we get it wrong in higher education, there are prices to pay for that in business, in society, in nonprofits, in families, and in all sorts of other ways. So I'm going to lay my cards out plainly at the end and talk to you about some of my concerns as a president, a senior president, it turns out now at only 6 years. And some of those have been heightened by the pandemic. But let's talk a little bit about the pandemic and how it affected King. And I go back to February of last year when I was in Phoenix attending a meeting of presidents in a wonderful organization called the Association of American Presidents of American Colleges and Universities, APACU. It's a great group because the group gathers, it's a small group, probably 50 presidents that we gather once a year at the same hotel, same place every year, no agenda. And the first order of business is we write up on the whiteboard the things that we want to talk about, that we think as presidents we ought to talk about. And I think it's one of the greatest type of conferences I go to. There are no PowerPoints. There are no, everything is what we need to be talking about with our peers. And so we began writing things up. Our president at the time was the president of Center University. He was sitting up there writing things out. And I think number 3 or 4 on the list was this thing called coronavirus. Now this is the end of February. The virus had struck up in Washington State, had not migrated other places. Not a single president there had a case on his or her campus at that time. And not much thinking had been done about it. And so we were talking in a very what-if manner. What if this thing really is bad? What if it reaches our corner of the United States? What if it actually affects us? Interestingly, we had had that very discussion at the cabinet at King only about 10 days earlier, so mid-February. We had already gone through a pretty detailed discussion about what if this virus becomes a pandemic. And I don't know why we did that. It turns out, however, that everything we identified that we would need to do, every problem we identified, we had already thought through. So when we then got to a point of decision making, which had to come quickly and rapidly, we already had the information, we'd already thought things through, and it was very, very valuable. We were the only college represented at that meeting that had done that. No one else really at their campuses that was represented in that meeting had done that. This was the first time many of those schools had thought about how they would respond. Actually, Admiral, I like to credit the Navy perhaps with that sort of planning, that sort of contingency planning. But it paid off for us in a mighty big way. By the end of that conference in Phoenix, the airport was empty. Everything had changed. In that 1 week, everything changed, as you will remember. And when I got back, we were dealing with the question of what do we do because the virus is moving fast, and what do we do as it gets worse? What do we do with classes? Our decision that spring was to go online at spring break. That was a traumatic experience for many, many schools because those schools did not have the technology to do it. They were in a rush to buy the technology they needed. They didn't have the software or hardware. But fortunately, King, because we have a robust online program, this was painless for us. Almost all of our professors had taught in the online context as well as the face-to-face context. And so for them to shift to online was really not difficult at all. We already had most of the technology that we needed. We were delayed 1 week that we used to teach our students how to use, in our case, Microsoft Teams, which we use internally, a wonderful program. But it was very, very smooth. It was not difficult at all. And we learned an awful lot, obviously. I was teaching in the spring. I try to teach 1 class a year just to stay current and to keep connected to students and to faculty and their concerns. So I was able, as the president, to experience what our faculty were experiencing, and if there were glitches, I could identify them as quickly as anyone. And I thought it was a great time to be teaching. I learned a lot about students, too. As with employees, some students thrive in that distance environment, and others struggle. Some are more productive, perhaps, than they would be if they were in the normal routine, and others far less so. In my class, everyone did well. I checked in with them all the time, but one student who had been an A student simply fell apart, lacking discipline, lacking order, lacking routine, being in his parents' basement in pajamas, probably staying up too night. He really fell into a terrible state and was lucky to withdraw from the class with a D. And it was sad because this was a student who would have done well. Well, the students fell into those categories. Very few did better online. Very few did worse. Most of them, though, I would say, did fine, but really, really wanted to be back in person. In fact, from the moment we went online, we heard from students, we want to be back in the classroom. And we committed early on that March to being back in the classroom no matter what it took come fall. And unlike a lot of schools, we did. We got back in the fall. I'm happy to say that at King we had none of the problems of faculty saying we don't want to teach, we don't want to go to school, we're scared, etc. We just had none of that. Our faculty thrive on being in the classroom with their students. They were delighted to be back in the fall with students. Now that did not happen easily. It was actually easier to go online than it was to come back in person because we had to do the extraordinarily technical and difficult job of scheduling classes so that we could have 6 feet of distance in every classroom. That was not easy. We had to institute all sorts of different procedures with dining and with residence halls. We had to put in an elaborate testing regime in order for our athletes to participate, even though eventually most athletics were shifted to the spring. So we did basically 3 seasons of athletics in one semester, which was itself pretty incredible. We deliberately stopped in the fall early at Thanksgiving and had exams all done by distance, but all the classes were done face-to-face for our traditional program in Bristol. And we also delayed returning in January by a week or two. And frankly, the reason for doing that was to get as many of our students, we didn't say this, to get as many of our students having been exposed and gotten the virus as we're going to get it, and giving them time from New Year's to get over it before they returned to school. So in the fall, we had a quarantine hall. We emptied out one dorm floor for quarantine with separate entrances. In the fall, we had students in quarantine pretty much all the time. We also had technology in our classrooms that enabled all the classes to be participated in by those quarantined students. So that's one bit of technology we did add. These are 360-degree conference cameras called OWLs that went in all of our classrooms. And very early on we learned that our greatest incentive to get students to hew to the requirements was quarantine. They did not want to be in quarantine. Now, I'm sure there were some introverts that loved being alone in their room and having their meals delivered to their door and so forth, but the vast majority of our students desperately wanted out of quarantine. They saw wearing masks as the way they could avoid quarantine, and that was a good thing. People ask me all the time, did masks work? I believe they worked when they were used. So we had no cases we could trace to classrooms where students were together for the longest period in a closed space. And we had no cases, faculty or students, that we could trace, because we traced all of our cases to classroom. We had no transmission in classrooms, and that's where the masks were being worn perhaps the best. Most of our transmission probably happened in athletic practice, but I think most of it happened in social context off campus when we weren't watching and the masks came off. That's what I think really, really happened. By the spring, however, and I was careful never to use this term, but we had reached herd immunity. We did not drop the mask, but we knew that we had reached immunity on the campus. Not among our faculty and staff, but among our students. We knew about 20% of our students had had the virus, perhaps 25%. That's what we knew from testing. But the reality was the figures were probably in the 80% had had the virus, and many of those students had no idea they had had the virus. And we knew this because we would have a team that in the fall had been like basketball. Everyone seemed to have gotten the virus. Then all of a sudden we'd have a case pop up in the spring, and no one that the student had been around, athletically, academically, in the residence hall, had caught it. There was virtually no spread. And so we were very fortunate. We were going weeks without a single case at all. When it was all over at graduation, we had 2 graduations in person, so we could spread people out a bit. When it was all over, we had no serious cases at King. We were fortunate. We had lots of people, sadly, who lost family members, who had very, very ill parents and grandparents. We had a trustee who lost his wife, who had some other conditions, but it was COVID that killed her. So we did have all the sadness attending COVID at King, but we fortunately had none of our faculty or staff or students have a serious case. And so we were richly blessed in that. So where are we now? Where are we now and today? Well, I removed the mask requirement, I think the day before the CDC did their 7th or 8th backflip on the question. And so we're not wearing masks now. We have asked those who have not been vaccinated on campus to wear masks. I suspect that will change by fall, so that if you have not had the virus and not been vaccinated, we will ask you to wear a mask. But we just don't know right now what the fall will bring. We gave all of our community the opportunity on campus to get the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, and so we were able to inoculate as many of our students as could do it. And so between the vaccinations and the immunity that they have at least for a season from having the virus, I think we're darn near 100% for returning students. We'll have some version of immunity come fall. And I think the vaccine, almost all of our faculty and staff have been vaccinated. And so I'm hoping we have a much, much more relaxed situation. The NCAA has signaled that they will not be requiring vaccination. There's not been a final decision on that, but as we are more than 50% athletes in our student body, what the NCAA says is important. Our conference will not be requiring vaccination of athletes because some of them are in states that do not allow mandatory vaccination. We have some publics, 2 publics in our conference that are not allowed to require vaccination, so it's going to be impossible for the conference to require it as well. So I doubt there will be mandatory vaccination forced on us from above unless something in the pandemic changes and the government gives direction that we have to require vaccination. So I doubt King will be requiring vaccination. Now, we will be giving carrots and sticks to folks to encourage vaccination. We will have the needles ready when they come back to give them jabs so that they can get their vaccination. If they do not choose to have a vaccine, they are subject to quarantine. And as I said, that's the thing the students hate the most. So they will have that incentive. If they are not vaccinated and they're in quarantine, they can't play sports if they're an athlete, and they're not going to like that, and their coaches won't like that. That's an incentive. All of our students have a trip to Washington, D.C. when they're new, and so we'll have sophomores and new freshmen, sophomores delayed and new freshmen. They won't go on that trip unless they're vaccinated. Likewise, for service trips, for study abroad, vaccinations required. So there are going to be incentives built in for them to get vaccinated, and I think we'll have a high level of compliance because of that. I think we'll also we'll be unlikely to have many students quarantined if this past year is, this past spring is any indication. So what changed on our campus during the pandemic, other than that dramatic change that I described in the gathering we had the other day? We certainly gained some efficiencies. Many of the meetings we had were being done via Zoom or Teams, and I don't know how many of you participated in those. They tend to be much more efficient, even though they're less personal. They're much more efficient meetings. And so we seem to have gotten a lot of work done in a lot shorter period of time. And I think we're going to find that some of our meetings will remain in that format. We were able to cut back on some of our travel. There's an awful lot of travel in the academic world, and a lot of it does not add value. That's from accreditation visits to conferences and other things that can just as easily be done online. Now, the social part of that is important. The relationship building is important, so I don't think we can go entirely to that, but I think there'll be some savings of time and money looking forward to that in conferences. We did not stop working. We used it as an opportunity. I'm sure all of you did as well personally. This is a great opportunity to do certain things. I told the Admiral I actually went out and ran the Navy physical fitness test to make sure I could do it, and that was one of my pandemic projects, and I passed. And you know, what we did at the college was we worked on our new programs. So we have a Master of Social Work that begins online this fall, a high demand program that we've been asked for, and we're responding with that program. We've hired the faculty to do that, and we're in the accreditation cycle exactly where we need to be for that. We have a new concentration in psychiatry and mental health for our nurses. It can either be done, it's a master's level program, and we have a full cohort already constituted for that program in the fall. We have also, because of demand, added a special ed to our education degree program. It's a concentration that can be done either in the degree program or can be added as an endorsement for those who already have a degree. So those are three pretty major programs to do online, and the student who wants the traditional college education. My old boss at Berry College used to say, as long as there are teenagers wanting out of their parents' basement and parents wanting the teenagers out of their parents' basement, there will always be a place for residential college education. And I will tell you, the teenagers wanted out of their basements. They wanted out of their rooms and out of their houses. They wanted to be away from home and grow up and enjoy all the social interaction, the growing up that happens in community at a college. And we saw this not only with the students who were demanding to come back in the fall, and we fulfilled that ably. We saw it in the students who called us, the prospects, because there were certain other schools they were considering that had not opened. So they had two questions for us. Were you open this year? They were checking our bona fides. Were we really going to be open? And two, can you promise me you'll be open in the fall of 2021? And we were able to tell them we were open and that we will be open in the fall of 2021. That was important to them. They did not want to go to a school that admitted them only to find out that they were only going to go online. Now, that is the traditional student coming out of high school. Before the pandemic, and heightened at the beginning of the pandemic, were many, many predictions that traditional college education was over. It was done, that this would be the great force that would move all of these students into distance education, and that the college campuses were going to become relics and were no longer going to have any particular use. Everything now would become virtual, and the opposite, I would say, had happened. I think you would find most traditional colleges would tell you the same thing. The second thing we learned, though, is that for adult learners, and we'd already seen this migration, we saw adult learners moving from face-to-face to online. King has had these three revenue streams for some time of online, face-to-face adult learning, and a traditional campus in Bristol. And we've been seeing movement as the default for many adult learners has moved to online. I think the pandemic is going to strengthen that, and so we're going to see lessening of the face-to-face adult market as people became more comfortable with online. Adults became more comfortable with online during the pandemic. There are exceptions to this, particularly anything involving labs and so forth, but I think in general we're going to continue to see a decline in our adult face-to-face numbers and holding steady or going up with our online numbers. Our people ask me, what does fall look like at the Bristol campus? Right now we're dead on where we were last year, and dead on is exactly where I'm happy to be. That to me is good news right now. So that's sort of the lessons we learned. We do have the challenge now of essentially having lost almost 2 years of face-to-face recruitment. And the only comfort we have in this is that our competitors have lost the same thing. Our coaches have not been able to go out and recruit face-to-face. Our admissions staff has not been able to go to college fairs because there have been none. They've not been able to visit high schools because so many have been closed, at least to outsiders. And so we're having to play catch-up, all of us are, and we don't know. So people say how many students we have in the fall. I say ask me 10 days after classes begin, because I do not know. Right now the numbers look good, but I think all of us are going to be struggling for the next 2 years with numbers because we haven't had our experts out recruiting as we should. So let me switch here and talk a little bit about some of my concerns about higher ed, and I'll go through these quickly and then open up for questions. People from time to time will say, what do you think higher ed will look like in 10 years or 20 years? And I have no idea what it will look like. I do think it will change less than people assume it will change. Because higher ed moves very, very slowly. It's often said it's easier to change the course of history than a course in history. And I think that's true. I'm concerned. Here's what concerns me. I'm concerned by the loss of standards, not only at the college level, but going all the way back into elementary school. We inherit those students who come out of schools where students have not learned to read or write appropriately. We inherit students who do not have the basic math skills to enable them to be admitted to King, or if they are admitted, to do well. We see all of that. And now I see within higher ed, and part of this is driven by numbers, a loosening of standards. And I understand all the temptations for loosening standards. I understand that. But what concerns me the most is, what does it do for a student if you loosen standards to bring a student in who's paying tuition, and that student, by the way, is unlikely to make it through? What does it do for that student that you bring in who is going to fail, and you know that student's not going to make it, or you should know, and what good does it do when that student now is borrowing to pay for that? And there's far, far too much of that going on. And I'm very, very insistent with our admissions personnel that we not admit people that we do not see reasonably as graduates in 4 years. We are aware of other schools that have taken people in as freshmen for sports purposes or just to make numbers, only to see them leave as sophomores. And of course that's self-defeating, because now you have to recruit 2 people instead of 1 to keep your numbers up. But worse than that, it's not fair to that student. That student might have succeeded in some other context at some other school. But right now, with the abandonment of standardized tests, which, say what you will about the fact they are not perfect and they are not the only good indicia of performance, they do fulfill an important role. And performance on a standardized test is indeed a decent predictor of success in college. But school, my own school, we have tests optional. That was that way before I got there. But I worry about the wholesale abandonment of standardized tests. I'm very concerned by the lack of intellectual diversity, or to put it another way, the political uniformity at many schools within American higher education. One of the great strengths of American higher education is its diversity. That is, there are schools that are more conservative, and there are schools that are more liberal. There are schools that have focuses on one type of economics or another type of economics. There are schools that respond to the particular characteristics of their region, and others that respond to the characteristics of their region. There is this wonderful, wonderful tapestry of schools within American higher education that has given that richness and that color and the depth and that diversity. And yet, for all that's said about diversity, there is an enormous effort to make all schools exactly the same politically, culturally, and so forth. And I think that's very bad for our country, and it's very, very bad for schools that serve particular types of students. And I think that's very unfortunate. That's a subset of the larger problem of the politicization of everything in our country. You know, you should be able, frankly, to go to a college sports event without having it be politics. Free speech has waned on many college campuses, and I think that's a shame. That's the one place where people should be able to talk, should be able to share ideas, should be able to exchange disagreements in a civil fashion, and yet we see free speech going away, and this bothers me. That's a subset of another problem, abandoning any notion of truth. Now being pursuit of truth is important. It doesn't mean you get there. It doesn't mean you can be sure that you found the truth. It doesn't mean that you can be cocky. Indeed, I would say the pursuit of truth should make you humble. But when the notion of what is true and right, even in mathematics or science, is thrown out the window, one has to ask about the quality of higher education. The notion of safety, that is, telling a student that you're unsafe because you're exposed to an opinion that you don't like or that's unfamiliar, to me is a terrible thing to do to the student, because that student will leave college and go into a society or go to another country or go to someplace different and be confronted with things that are different. And if all they've been prepared to do is to stay in some little ghetto, an ideological ghetto of people just like them, or to stay in some echo chamber, we have failed those students. And there's far, far too much of that. We've also set them up for trauma, because if we've told a student that it's trauma to be confronted with ideas that you don't like or people that are different, then they will have that trauma. Sure enough, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I'm bothered too by the preference for state education over private education. Most state institutions become bureaucracies. They often become detached from those who fund them, the taxpayers. I think one of the great things about private education is that we have a responsiveness to our constituencies that perhaps is lacking on the public side. And yet the publics are highly, highly subsidized in ways that schools like King and Milligan and Emory and Henry will never be. And yet we soldier on and do a pretty darn good job, I think, and do it efficiently without a lot of waste. There's antagonism toward faith at many schools. It used to be said there were faith-based schools, there were faith-friendly schools, there were faith-neutral schools, and there were faith-antagonistic schools. King would be considered a faith-based school. There are far, far more schools now that are openly antagonistic to religion. And I don't mean just the Christian religion, I mean religion in general, or faith. And I think that's a squalid and terrible place to be, because that, as I hope you share with me, a sense, whatever your religious views, that this is a deep, deep part of who we are as humans, and what motivates us in service to others, and what guides us in our ethics, and what guides us in our commitment to community. All of this, in my view, comes down to one thing, and I'll circle back and say that what King does well is focus on students. Every decision I make as president comes back to the question, is this better for our students? And by the way, it's not what our students want. I don't ask that question. I say, is this what's best for our students or the student? And that's with respect to personnel decisions, curricular decisions, financial decisions. Every single question comes back to that. And that's certainly nothing I came up with. A lot of schools give lip service to what students do, but what they really are saying is they want the students to fund the school. I'm saying that individual student, what is best for that student? And those are hard decisions sometimes, but I think that crystallizes what we do and makes it very, very clear. So with that, I'll end. I thank you for your attention. I'm really grateful for the invitation and for your hearing a bit about King, and happy to answer any questions if there's any time for any questions.